All right, well, we can kick things off. Howdy, folks and online folks. My name's Jeremy Huff, and I have been involved in workflows for about 5 years now, ever since being approached by the FOLIO community to build a prototype, proof of concept for integrating workflows into FOLIO. And that was really the first time I ever had any involvement with automated workflows, but it just has not stopped.
You're not sharing slides.
Oh, I just assumed that. Oh, okay. Yeah. No, don't be sorry. So I guess if I just share screen. All right. Get this out of the way. And I'm also going to endeavor to hide this thing up at the top. Hide loading meeting controls. Okay. All right. Okay. Back to it. My name is Jeremy Huff. I'm here with Ian Walls and Martinez, and we have put these slides together and an attempt to kind of update the community on workflows and kind of where we're at. Last year, Sebastian and I gave a talk at Hamburg at WOLFcon on workflows, and there have been developments for workflows for FOLIO in the interim since last year, and now they are mostly of an organizational nature and not so much of a technical nature. So some portion of the slides that you're going to see in the next few minutes are going to be rehashing some of the technical details that were presented on last year, just to kind of get everyone up to speed on where things are at. So if you attended the talk last year, just quite honestly, are going to see some of the same information, but that's okay. Please bear with me. So yeah, I'll start moving through these slides. We're going to start off with just some definitions of what we are talking about when we are talking about workflows. As I said, we'll go over kind of the current state of the implementation. And then we're going to try to have, we call this brainstorming. We're going to attempt to have a more interactive component for this. What we hope to do is to lean on the community to continue doing requirements gathering for workflows. We're hoping to get some development done in the near future, and an important part of development is understanding what the community needs out of workflows. And so for a couple of these agenda items here, we're going to be using a Jamboard. So I don't know if y'all want to pull out your laptops or cell phones. There'll be a QR code up on the screen, and I will post a link in the chat at that point in time. And Ian it'll give us all an opportunity to kind of just express our perspective on some of the general use cases for workflows, and then maybe even share some specific workflows at your organizations and institutions that you are aware of. These can be manual workflows, these could be automated workflows. We're just kind of looking for what is out there so we can start teasing the details of what our product, the workflow product, needs to be able to accomplish. Any questions before we dive in? All right. Okay, so I'm excited to say that we have formed a SIG in the last few months, and we have had our inaugural meeting. And one of the top priorities of that meeting was to start defining what we mean by workflow. And I will say that, I don't know, what do you think? This is a working definition, maybe, but
it's all carved in soap.
Yes, yeah, carved in soap. Yeah. Yeah, so this is where we're at with it so far, and we'll see how this might evolve over time. But what we have come up with in our initial meeting was a persistent user-defined series of automated tasks and manual steps that satisfy a local business process across FOLIO modules and apps in an efficient and powerful way that is executable by a workflow engine. So we're all going to need to memorize that before we move on. Yeah, I think there's a lot of good details there, a lot of really important aspects of what we're trying to accomplish. And we'll just need to maybe turn it over to a wordsmith to get some of the clunkiness out of it. But when we're talking about the workflow app, we're talking about a user interface that allows for the creation, maintenance, and completion of workflows within FOLIO. So these are different ways that we will be interacting with the workflows as defined previously. We're going to want to create them and manage them, but also as participants in the business processes of a library, we're also going to want to interact with these workflows as they're running. So we're going to need to figure out ways to do both of those things. And then finally, workflow engine is the underlying software that executes the workflow. It's the software that's running in the background that's advancing workflow from task to task and step to step. And there are a lot of different workflow engines on the market. The specific one that we have dived into for the proof of concept is Camunda, but I am aware that at our various institutions, there's all sorts of workflow engines that we're used to. And so as we'll get into in the implementation, we've tried to make some allowance for that fact and build a system that is, at least in theory, at least conceptually extensible to other workflow engines. Okay. As I said, this next section is going to rehash some things that have been presented on before, but if you haven't been to previous presentations on workflows, it'll be new information. And I'm going to try to move pretty quick because we have an hour, and I'd love to spend as much time as we can kind of more on the interactive portion of things rather than me just talking at you guys. Okay. We currently have 4 components to our implementation of workflow engines. I work at Texas A&M. I think I maybe forgot to mention that, but I work at Texas A&M, and we are running the proof of concept that we developed back in 2018 in production at Texas A&M. It consists of these 4 components. 2 of them are modules that desperately need some updating, but Mod Workflow and Mod Camunda. And then 2 of them are components that we use to interact with those modules that ultimately, when we build a user interface, we won't need. Some of my colleagues get irritated with me when I say that these need to be replaced. I suppose you could continue to use them after the user interface is around, but I really hope we build a user interface that is so awesome that no one will want to mess with these things. So, but we'll see what happens. Essentially, I'll get into the details of what all of these components do, but that is the lay of the land right now are these components: Mod Workflow, Mod Camunda, FW, which we, FOLIO workflow is the idea, FW registry, FW CLI, command line interface that we use to kind of knit all the stuff together. Mod Workflow provides a workflow interface to a copy. It implements the workflow interface, and it manages and persists a workflow object. So this is an object representation of what we feel like a workflow needs to be. For now, I suppose a lot of what will happen in the future is refining that object representation of a workflow and making sure that it is capable of expressing everything that we as a community need a workflow to do and be. Mod Camunda provides the workflow engine interface to a copy. It consumes one of these workflow objects from Mod Workflow and converts it to BPMN, which is an XML format that Camunda uses to execute its workflows. It also runs, active workflows using the Camunda workflow engine. So the reason we have 2 separate components for this is to address this idea that, Camunda is one option for workflow engines, but there are others. So at least in theory, a organization that uses something like Airflow can implement the workflow engine interface against an alternate workflow engine, and they might not be making BPMN, they might be making what are the DAGs, the direct rate graphs. I forget what Airflow uses, but they might be converting the workflow object to something else that can be consumed by their particular workflow engine. But this alternate implementation would enable the same user interface to interact with a different workflow engine. So that's kind of the general concept behind separating out these pieces. All right. For the FW registry and the FW CLI, these are client-side interfaces that we use for interacting with Mod Workflow. They were a stopgap solution just because at the time that we were building the proof of concept, we decided not to invest our development energy into user interface, though there are some great prototypes that have existed for since the beginning of FOLIO. So there has been some has been some thought put into what these user interfaces might be already. All right, I have no idea if that's legible or not, but this is a diagram of the current state of the workflow object, and you can see that it's sparse. It's not got a lot going on. It has an identifier and a name. It has a version. We have some configuration options on there, time to live, a human description. It has a Boolean that indicates whether or not it's active. Because every workflow can have multiple deployments, it can indicate what, whether or not it's deployed. And then it has a few objects on it for configuration. But really the most important thing are the nodes array right there. So you can see that this graph that we have up on the screen has 2 nodes, start event and end event, and basically everything that the workflow does is just an array of tasks is what we call them. And these objects are right here. These are the tasks that we have so far. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that some of these probably can be combined. We probably don't have all of the ones that we need. And I imagine a lot of the work of the SIG is going to be identifying specifically what tasks are needed. I don't know. Y'all probably don't want me to read through all these, but you can see that we're able to do things like FTP and email, interact with file systems. I will say that A&M's implementation so far has focused very heavily on the automated part of workflows and not on the manual interactions with workflows. But that's definitely a very important part of what we want for workflows in the future. So in Camunda lingo, I think they call them spinning chair tasks. These are the idea of the workflow will get to a point in time where it just freezes and waits for additional human interaction, human input. And so that's going to be a really important task to get down, a task that waits and solicits a user for some input in order to advance to future stages. This is just real quickly some diagrams that kind of show how these components interact with each other. Building a workflow is a step that when we have a user interface will be replaced by somebody just sitting at that user interface and assembling the workflow. But since we have developers making these workflows now, what they do is they type up massive and super boring JSON documents that they save in the FW registry. And then they use the command line tool to run a build command that will grab that JSON out of the FW registry, turn it into a request object that it posts up to mod workflow, and then mod workflow saves that object in its database. And so this is just currently how we build a workflow. Again, once we have a user interface, this step will not be needed. Activating a workflow is essentially giving instructions to mod workflow to send a specific workflow object over to mod Camunda. Mod Camunda then converts that into BPMN and saves that in its database. And then finally, running a workflow is just a matter of sending a request to mod workflow. Again, you can see here the rationale. We expect our user interface to interact with mod workflow. We don't want it to know anything about the specific workflow engine that's running. That it's an important separation for us. So the request to run a workflow goes to mod workflow. A trigger is published by mod workflow that's received by mod Camunda. It retrieves the appropriate workflow from its database and deploys it to the workflow engine, and that gets it running. I don't have a slide for questions. I do want to get into the interactive piece here in a second, but that was a lot of information, I know. And so we can't necessarily spend a ton of time in questions, but are there any questions or anything I can clarify from that? suppose I should be looking for online as well. Oh, thank you so much. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about some general use cases for workflow. Here are some general use cases that we have identified so far. You can do creation, retrieval, updating, or deleting of entities within FOLIO. We see them as being potentially very useful for integrating FOLIO with external systems in the library. Most of the workflows at Texas A&M currently are for the purpose of report generation. That's what we use them for by and large. It's not exclusively for that purpose, but I think out of like, I don't know, 15 workflows, 10 of them are about reports, something like that currently. We toyed around with workflows as a tool for our data migration when we initially went from Voyager to FOLIO. At the time that we did that, the APIs were not, a lot of them were not performant enough to work in that regard. But I think that these days that it might be worth a second look. So that's another possibility. And then the idea of bulk edit on edge cases. So we have a bulk edit app, but maybe if there's something that you want to bulk edit that the bulk edit hasn't really addressed yet or something, workflows are an alternate solution for that. So it's time for us to put our thinking caps on. I'm going to hand things over to Ian here. I'm also going to attempt to, do you have a link to the Jamboard?
Yeah, I can drop the link into
chat. Well, because I was thinking I would be on my slide deck, but this is a PDF, so I actually don't have access to to this one. Oh, okay.
We've got folks in the gym.
Okay.
Little animals are appearing in the corner.
Okay. All right. If anyone's having trouble getting onto the Jamboard on the from the online folks, or if anyone's in chat and on the Jamboard, do everyone a favor and just pop a link into the chat. That would be awesome. But yeah, we're going to transition to trying to identify some other general use cases. So yes, ma'am.
Workflow, just so I get
Sure. Sure. Yeah. So, for instance, we have there's a report I'm working on right now that is for uncataloged e-serials, right? So we use SFX for our e-serials. And so what we want to do is identify all of the records that we have in SFX that aren't in FOLIO. And once we identify those, bundle them up into a CSV, zip them up, and email them to our cataloging folks so they can get on that and and so this is a multi-step process. It has to stop off at multiple points of data. Some of these are longer running queries where, we don't necessarily want someone using a web interface, clicking on a link and then waiting for 5 minutes, while this loads. And so we can build a workflow that runs on a schedule. And once that schedule ticks over, it can fire up and it can grab this data from over here and go to the LDP and grab this data and take a look at it and convert that to a CSV, the results to a CSV, zip it up and email it to a designated location. So that's a very simple example, but okay, yeah.
Similarly, can you give an example of a FOLIO entity creation or update?
Sure. Tags. I have a workflow that we use to, and I actually don't know the current state of tag CRUD in FOLIO, but at the time, I think it was removal of tags was not possible through the UI. But you know what? I'll be damned if I'm going to let them tell me I can't delete a tag. So. So we built a workflow for just the management of tags in the system. So yeah, I think, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna hand things over to you.
All right.
Do you want to stand here so you can be?
Yeah. Hopefully I can click through and this will just display for everyone. All right. Hang on. Oh, good. It actually worked. This is why I keep my laptop open so I can actually see what everybody else is seeing. All right. It's that. And sure. All right. How familiar are folks with Jamboard? Is this a newish thing? Super comfortable thing? Okay. So me too. I've facilitated all of one thing with this at work. Think of this as a whiteboard with Post-it notes. So, and oddly enough, it's not the default selection here, but if we just grab this little guy and we have a sticky note, it's literally what they're called. You can throw something up there and say, all right, so what are some general use cases for workflows and folios? We can say, save. And it wants me to keep coming up with ideas because that's the idea. But now we have these little stickies here that we can move around. We can change the colors. We can group them. We can link them together. So everyone in the room and online, you were invited to come to this Jamboard and start throwing up some stickies. So what are some general use cases for workflows in Folio? Now I'm going to ask the folks in the room here who want to speak aloud. If you want to throw out some ideas in the room, I can repeat them and then put them on the Jamboard. So I can manage the tool part for you, and you just come up with the thinky bits. And while folks online come up with their, yep, well, we got it, it's moving, great, it's happening. We'll go from there. So what other ideas do folks have about what could be a general use case for workflows in Folio? Owen.
Those are repeated on a scheduled basis, like annual. And you want to know, did it last year? You know, will it get next year? So, like, yeah, so annual might be might be offset on, for instance, the cancellation deadline. Agree with that with the bigger like you have to done that best for the deadline. The Facebook substation. There's a cycle, and you want to come directly on that cycle, and then you want to again next cycle.
Right. So I'm not sure if anybody was able to hear that online, but hopefully the stickies were able to capture that basic concept of looking at sort of recurring actions that need to be done, especially in the ERM context. There's things, I've got to check this annually. So you have sort of a scheduled cron kind of basis for the whole thing. But then there's also looking at dates within a particular object. So X days before this thing, I need to do this. And then that might wind up changing the date, and then you follow up with it again the next time that's relevant. Okay, so the mic's a little bit closer to my face now. Hopefully that's some better audio. Sorry. And there is not a tasks app as part of the Folio ecosystem fully yet. There has been work done on it in the community, but it's not folded into any of the Flower releases. One idea that we had talked about in the last couple days was using the dashboards interface to be able to serve as a place where users can go and see on a per user basis, these are things I have to deal with. And that could be as simple as, here are my records that I want to look at, or it could be, here are the things I need to look at and actions I need to take. And now that I'm feeling much more confident about how to, add more widgets to dashboard and what the structure is for that, I feel like that's becomes pretty reachable. And so that could either be a pause in an existing workflow for human interaction, or it could be end workflow, put on list, action, start new workflow, depending on what you say.
Yeah. I agree.
All right. Move it a little bit closer. I'm going to exit out of adding sticky notes, and we're going to take a look at all this. Look at all this wonderful stuff. Look at this. No, never. I don't know. I'll try. Control plus. That's going the wrong way.
It's getting worse.
What?
There.
What? The controls are reversed. This is madness. Okay, cool. So, oh boy. Okay, so typically in a session like this, we would go through and we would start grouping some of these concepts together. So I think this is the part where I awkwardly start reading and start dragging things. If folks in the Jamboard see things that sort of make sense conceptually as well, feel free to start pulling things together. So tasks app, so we talked about that. Identifying purchase orders. So this is a question. Okay. Perfect. Report generation across multiple data sources. Oh, the little plus ones they're doing their own thing. They don't follow. They're not linked. Sorry, everybody. If you've got a plus one, it's loose. It's hanging out on its own. Yes.
Jamboard after this on ways that Google can improve.
All right. So, okay, so we're seeing the distinction between general capabilities and specific actions. So, wrapping my head around that. Oh, the plus one. There, license negotiation processes, automated accounts receivable, binding and sift. Okay, so yeah. And, I think maybe if I stop moving it for a second, we can settle things down. I'm seeing a lot of plus ones. All right, co-working in ERM, when a journal package is renewed, the content may change. Acquisition staff will assign a task to ERM staff to update the knowledge base. So yeah, combination workflow to do kind of process.
The Jamboard right now, but I want to kind of plus one that and also say we have a lot of like heavily human mediated workflows, right? Where catalog is a great one. We've got to go to a catalog supervisor for review and then send it back to the technician and kind of a string of events. I mean, the automation applications are great, but sometimes it's just like getting stuff out of people's inboxes and into a coordinated application. I don't know if that's tasks or workflow. Sure.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Shrank this thing way down. Oh, and it's so tiny now.
While possibly what we're talking about is some of these will earlier than data being pushed as a result of that data is not that obviously can be done by hand, but perhaps it's an opportunity for that to be important, or at least be an opportunity to a system.
Additionally, can you report off of this? Like, could you identify bottlenecks or like how long something is sitting in a specific task? Oh, sorry.
Oh, do we have an additional mic?
Do we have a sec? No, we don't. My brain gets overloaded.
In the line, get in the line and come up and talk.
Great, do that. Okay, so we were talking about sort of the human intervention portion of tasks. We have workflows that are very much a person does this and then a person does that. And we also have a bunch of cases where we have things that are automated, and how we're going to stitch those kind of things together into a more cohesive, complete end-to-end workflow. And there may be opportunities there where what you're doing becomes more automatable once it's fully laid out. Like, oh, I realize a person is just saying yes or no to this, but they're saying yes or no based on this policy that we have written down. And a computer could do that policy with enough information. You could maybe save a human being some time in the future. Owen, I'm going to let you use the mic because I'm terrible with this facilitating.
Just so the other thing that strikes me about that concept of say one team doing something and then another team having to pick up some work as a result is that we definitely hear time and again I hear as a PO for some of these things, they want to get an email or some active notification. It's not like you want to log into Folio or a system to see what your tasks are. You want to be actively notified. I think email seems to be the common denominator there, kind of understandably. But it's got to be some kind of active process, not a passive, I want to go and check these things. So that comes across time and again. I'd also say we can chat afterwards, but we did a whole load of work about what's workflows are needed for ERM, and I can probably churn out some examples based on that. So.
All right, we got a mic runner.
Oh, I was just nodding in agreement. I don't think I have. Oh yeah, I was asking whether you could report on this data and whether you could capture things like how long tasks are sitting at a specific step in a workflow, like to identify bottlenecks and problems.
One of the challenges that we're going to have is to assess the capabilities that are common to all the workflow engines that we want to target for inclusion, right? But at least with Camunda, what you asked about is definitely possible. There's all sorts of kind of meta processes that you can bake into the workflow for things like error handling and things like that, things that you're going to want to make your workflow robust. But then also these sorts of analyses that you're talking about are possible. They're not anything that we've touched on so far, but it should be possible. And I imagine it would be a possible in workflow engines that I'm less familiar with, but that remains to be seen. And I guess a third option is if it isn't possible in all the workflow engines we're wanting to potentially integrate, we might be able to provide more functionality kind of on the Folio side to kind of bridge the gap. So I think if something were a high enough priority, it could probably justify that sort of thing. And I see Sebastian has his hand up.
Yes, a comment I'd add to that is it would seem obvious to me, or at least part of the value from my perspective of having workflows and the individual tasks be first-class citizens in Folio as opposed to something that lives in an entirely different system is that you could tie it into whatever reporting solution you're using and use it to build custom reports that operate at the level of those types of workflows and tasks.
Yeah.
So you could imagine the workflow providing reporting mechanisms, but it would also seem really rational to have it be part of whatever reporting solution you're using with Folio.
Yeah. So that would just be at that point just a matter of making sure that these objects that live in Folio have relevant metadata kind of on them as far as like time created, last time run, those sorts of things. And there's no reason why that data can't be captured for these objects.
I want to throw one out as a possible use case for workflows. checkout. Checking out a material is it's a workflow. You're kicking off, given this thing and this person, do a process, and not everyone does that exactly the same way. So what if that could be taken out of being baked into the code of how Folio does checkout this way, to Folio has a checkout workflow. This is the default. And if you need to modify it to your institutional needs, you can do that. Things like checking whether a user has signed a certain licensing agreement or they've done some sort of behavior there. A lot of the things that are done in the circulation rules could probably be checked and other conditions verified. Being able to dig deeper into, yes, they're this patron group, but are they in this department? And is that captured? So you don't necessarily have to split. If you're, say, getting your person feed from central IT and they don't differentiate in a way that you need to differentiate for policy. I've seen libraries do all kinds of crazy things. I would open that as a concept. And rather than completely jump off the train tracks that I've now thrown a bomb onto by doing this, sorry, it's a bad habit. How are folks feeling about this particular Jamboard? We've got a lot of stuff. The organization process is one I frankly don't want to subject you all to, like, completely sorting that out. But are there any other things that folks want to throw on there? I'm still seeing a couple new stickies appearing from sort of general use cases. And actually, Kristen, so you're...
Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry. I was going to say, building on what you were saying with circ rules, why I always kind of wanted to do with the workflow engines was tie that into notifications and requests. Because there's a lot of gaps right now with notifications that, because of the way the notice policies are written, they're very static. They do not change based on if a request is made, if the item status has changed or anything else of that nature has changed. Where I think a workflow engine could help with that is when events like that happen, it could pick up and change things over to a different notice policy, kick off a regeneration of notices. I know there's also auto renewals that a lot of institutions want. I think that might be also another idea for this too.
So one thing I was thinking about, and I'd be curious to see what other people think. We do a lot of data import from record sets that come on a regular basis. So I'm thinking, like we get order files, approval files, invoice files, and like, is that something the workflow engine would be able to even like go out, get the files, reach out to MarcEdit, run the task, load the files, separate out the records that don't load for some reason, and be able to like give you a report like, hey, these are loaded, and like here's like the ones that didn't load that you're gonna need to investigate, or because we have like I feel like we have these processes and it's a batch process, but it's not an automated process, and so there's just a lot of like babysitting that has to happen with the steps, or just potential for error because somebody runs it in like the wrong profile, or there's some, the vendor makes errors too. So there's just a lot of potential for things to go wrong. And so it's kind of time consuming.
Yes. What you just described, I think, is especially when I mentioned integration, I think that's the exact sort of thing that both we have explored to some extent already with the current state of implementation, but definitely the sort of thing that could be explored even more with future development. But one of the things that I found interesting about your question, because this is possible but not currently in our current implementations, it sounded like the process that you were describing would be kicked off from some external event, external to Folio. And as it stands right now, I can I can kick off a workflow from outside Folio if I use our CLI and I say, hey, run this workflow. But most of our triggers either are time-based on some kind of cron job, or we also are able to intersect activity within Folio and trigger a workflow based on something happening in Folio. So, we can set up a workflow that's like listening for user creation or something like that. So anytime someone creates a user, it says, hey, a user was created in the system, and then that workflow can kick off and send out, hey, welcome to the library email or something like that, right? So, that's just an example. But for a process that occurs completely externally to Folio, to then be able to kind of, reach into Folio and say, hey, fire off that workflow, we would have to figure out how to initiate that. I mean, the tools are kind of there, but you would need to build some kind of external piece that was watching for a file to be placed in a directory or something, and then like sent off a request.
I'm curious what the concepts are around building the criterion for object transformation. So one of the things I really like about Metabase is that question builder of getting the resulting items that you want to transform, and then being able to define what it is you want transformed on that batch of items. Has any of that been fleshed out or discussed?
Yeah, so currently, I think ETL is definitely a general, a very workflow friendly process. And when we had that big list of tasks up on the board, one of the tasks was called a script task. And if I'm being totally honest, we're a bunch of developers. We haven't really developed this out to the point where we're handing it over to users. So that script task is kind of the hero of all of our workflows at this point, because it basically just says, all right, well, get a database task in there, query for some data, you get it in. But now we need to do something with that data. And so we just throw a script task in there, and we write some JavaScript, some kind of scripting language. It can use Python or Ruby or whatever. We use JavaScript because we're a bunch of web developers, and so we just write some JavaScript to manipulate that data and get it into the form we want, and then pass it on to whatever's next in the process. So currently, that's the way that works. I think that there are certainly some more user-friendly ways that you can devise to manipulate data as it moves through your pipeline of a workflow. But currently, that script task is the only task that we have that's really suited for that. It's flexible because it can run any arbitrary script that you might want to run. Another thing that I think is exciting about this, and Sebastian and I think talked about this a little bit last year, is these tasks don't have to be unique to a specific workflow. So once one is created in one workflow, we could devise a system in which you could share that task out to another workflow. So the reason I mention that is you might write a script task that does a certain manipulation on data that is useful and maybe in multiple workflows. So rather than having to recapitulate that every time you want to use it, you can just take that script task and say, now I also want to use it in this workflow. I see your hand, Sebastian.
I would just make the observation too that it may not be that all aspects of data manipulations and ETL have to live within the workflow mechanism itself. You could imagine that something like data imports, hopefully an improved data import, could be a receptacle that you could trigger from within a workflow a certain profile in data import or in some other more custom data manipulation tool, right? And definitely questions of performance and scaling in bulk in this type of environment would be really interesting. Mm-hmm. Running individual records through a workflow might not perform well, right?
There's something I was going to say, it left my mind, but then I saw Ian's hand up, so I'm going to let him rescue me.
Oh, cool. I get to be helpful. In the workflow engine that I use for my work, which is a completely different thing, there are several sort of key triggers that I wanted to highlight that I feel would be useful, as well as some sort of helper nodes, because it does also have a script node concept, right? So you can do all those arbitrary transformations in code language of your, well, not of your choice, unless you choose JavaScript or Python. Version 1's going to do Python. But for example, being able to trigger things not just on a schedule, but on a webhook event. So basically you fire off to a RESTful endpoint, which, hey, we've heard about those before. And say, when you hit this endpoint, initialize this workflow. Similarly, I think in the Folio context, one of the things that could be useful is listening to message queue systems. So being able to plug into Kafka and listen to, oh, there's a message sent here. I care about that message. Let me do something. And then also like on file change, while that may generate an event through some external means, it could also be if you're sending it to Folio in some Folio kind of way, oh, file changed, trigger action, and move those kind of things forward. So those are all reasonable possibilities for setting up ways of getting this thing started. And then once you've got in there, some of the helper nodes that I found particularly useful are just a simple rename, like being able to take a key and rename it to like, it's called this and this data object, but it's called this and this other data object, just because different developers were working on it in different decades. Or having set, define this is, this concatenated with this, or having just some basic kind of functions for being able to wire those things up. And those get me a really long way when doing a lot of the ETL kind of transformations. For example, nightly patron imports. Get a file is delivered, it's pulled, ground up, processed, looked against Folio for lookups, and then depending on whether the person exists or not, they're either updated or created.
This builds off, Ian, what you says a little bit, and also slightly lateral. Part of the vision that was talked about in the early days when workflows came together was the idea that workflows might be able to trigger very specific actions in existing apps, or pick up on events that were created or let loose by those apps. Sort of that at the application level. So we explored both sort of really low level approaches where the workflow engine might be able to see everything that passed through a copy, but also apps being very deliberate about saying, I've just done X, I've just checked out a book. Is anyone interested? Are there any workflows interested in that? I think it might be worth noting for this group as it moves forward that it will exist in a kind of dialogue, and it will have an advocacy role for POs in other parts of Folio to look at making Folio workflow friendly and to sell the value proposition to the folks that maintain circ and inventory and data imports. Say, what are the things that we can do here to, at a low bar for each of you, add capabilities that will empower Folio through the system.
Yeah, Maccabee. Well, I was just going to say, just to expound on that a little bit, and then I think we'll move on to your question, and then we'll move on. But that's exactly right. What Sebastian just expressed is right now the level of granularity of tasks and actions that you can kind of hook into is the Okapi API. And so as a developer, or previously a developer, I think that's awesome. It's like, look at all this stuff that I can do. But when I imagine the user interface that will allow you to, construct a workflow that is able to do absolutely everything that Okapi can do, while that's very powerful, it doesn't necessarily bring to mind the best UX in the world, right? I mean, it's a level of granularity that may be excessive, I suppose. It might be one way to look at it. So some of the other options that we've explored, as Sebastian was mentioning, is the ability for modules to kind of expose a surface for workflows to interact with that's a little bit more kind of curated or bundled, that could lend itself on our end to a much nicer user experience. But the problem with that is it requires all these module developers to kind of opt into our process. And so this is definitely a discussion that we're going to have as we move forward, is maybe we can do a hybrid approach where it's like if the module has exposed something nice and friendly, we can use it, but otherwise you just get kind of whatever the interface can do. Or I don't know, but I think that leveraging all of the passion and interest that we've seen for workflows to kind of put some pressure on the module developers out there to help us explore how we can make this a better user experience would be a good idea. And Maccabee, here you go.
Yeah, I'll be quick and hopefully also a little meta here. I'm sitting here as a developer and a geek and geeking out on all the details of, you know, the triggers and the workflow logistics and all that. But I know this is a conversation that's been happening as long as Folio has been happening. I think in order to make it move forward, what you guys have set up here in terms of like functionality use cases is what we need, right? We need, from a internal marketing perspective, a set of use cases for each of the major functional areas in Folio, ignoring honestly like the details of how it's actually triggered, even maybe just to get buy-in enough to move it forward.
Yeah.
That's a great segue, Maccabee, because I was gonna say we actually had another Jamboard set up, but I think that it was meant to address specific and rather than kind of general categories of workflow, specific workflows, but we actually got a lot of specific workflows listed here. So I think we've accomplished our goal. This clearly is an insane amount of content to talk about in a 1 hour session. And I don't think that, looking at this board, this exceeds my best expectations for the amount of output that we were hoping to extract from the community. What you all have just done is given the SIG and myself as a product owner a tremendous wealth of content for us to dive into over the next few weeks and months. So even though we weren't able to address everything that's up there here today, I'm super excited about being able to explore these things and kind of use them to prioritize our conversations moving forward. What Ian and I are going to be doing, I imagine, is pulling this board up and taking a look at it and starting to dig through it and tease out things that we could then bring forward in the SIG. And I have a few more slides, but here you go.
Yeah, thanks both. I just had a question. So thinking about some of the challenges that I often have when I'm talking to users about functionality that we offer in apps that I'm responsible for. And for example, we've been talking over the last few days about serials and the prediction of serials issues and the claiming of issues that don't arrive. And some of that functionality, like there's business logic there that needs to be built in a dedicated module. But some of that functionality then becomes about, for instance, we predict, there'll be 12 issues of this serial a year and they'll come on the first of each month. We need to build the logic that does that, and that's what we're doing. Then we intend to create a list of receiving issues that can be checked in, which is in another app. And then at some point, people will want to say, well, given these receiving issues that are still not arrived and have passed their expected receipt date, can we generate a claim for them? And both of those latter tasks seem to me like you could decide that that's a workflow. It looks like a workflow. It looks like the stuff we've just been discussing. Tell me after 30 days that this needs a claim, or generate that claim for me. How do we make sure that we don't see this as like a cure-all for everything that looks a little bit like a task, or is that okay? And when do we how can we as certainly me as a product owner think about when is something good fit for a workflow engine and a workflow module like this, and when should I really be knuckling down and building the functionality we need in Folio?
I think that's a fantastic question. I think that there's going to be a really interesting, if we build this the right way, I think there's going to be a really interesting interplay between module development and workflow capabilities. I think that you are, as a product owner, I think one way that you could look at it is if you built your module a certain way, and then you look out there and all these people are building workflows to get it to do something other than what you specifically designed it to do, that might be a great indication, that maybe be like, oh, maybe we should make that easier, to kind of go through the front door as it were for that. So I think you might see this as like kind of like a low key like market research or something like that. It's possible that could be the case, though. I think you are right. Your intuition is correct that I bet we'll see some pretty silly workflows out there. I think that's also a possibility. And I'm just drawing a blank on a great delineator. I mean, I suppose if you could do it fairly easily without the workflow, like if you just kind of stop and ask yourself a question, be like, well, if I just go into the app and do this, then yeah, you might. What we need is a stand-up routine of one of these future WOLFcons. You might not need a workflow if, and like.
I think I've got an idea for when that might be a case.
Okay.
So things in Folio are modular. And while we have a sort of platform core central sort of thing, different apps get bundled in different ways. I can envision someone running Folio without workflows. So if they were doing that and other apps, would you be able to do business with those other apps without depending on workflows? Is workflows going to be, are you making that a dependency for being able to do business? And if you are, is that okay? There may be cases where what you're doing is like, of course, we're going to need workflows because it's just that complicated. But could there be a way to do it natively just in your app that doesn't have that dependency that would open up more use cases for being able to use Folio for that particular purpose?
I think there was a real kind of dumbass low-level response to that at some point that might have said, hey, apps in a perfect world are just CRUDs for their business objects. And you landed in EIM, which is one of the places where people get the most hairy. But I think one way to answer too would be, there was a vision originally of workflow as the glue, as part of the operating system, the pipes, the Unix pipes of Folio, essentially, right? So in that situation, it would be fine to depend on them. But I also think that there's a kind of product management that you do when you have responsibility for an app. And part of the question that I think we've asked ourselves in some of the apps we built is, hey, might it be fun for this app to be able to stand alone as a separate product? And EIM is a classic example, right? I mean, lots of libraries run EIM by themselves, so you want it to be able to do everything. Resource sharing is another area. And there are other situations where clearly an app really only exists to serve the greater good. So I feel like there's a legit kind of product management question of what's the future, the resourcing opportunities and the engagement opportunities you see for the app that you're responsible for. So that's at least a take that I think we would have.
All right, guys, we got like 2 minutes left. Y'all have all done a great job, great participation. And I have to say, it doesn't surprise me at all because in my experience, year on year, the excitement or the interest in workflow just seems to strengthen every single time we talk about it. And I mean, honestly, I'd love to be able to come to a WOLFcon and talk about anything other than workflow. No, not just no, but these are some very broad goals that I think that we have for the next year. If you guys want to be involved in workflows more, we have a Slack channel, #workflows, right? And I think that's where once we nail down our common time for a SIG meeting, that's going to be announced on that channel. So get into that channel. You can get plugged in with the SIG and we can move this forward. For specific development goals, we want to complete requirements gathering, or at least first round of it. And I think what we did here today was an important step in that direction. We are going to be specifically targeting product council approval for our workflow approach. Also exploring getting approval from the technical council, maybe with an RFC for just kind of the general technical approach that we want to take. And this is, I'm going to leave with this for last minute here. Public sprints. This is a really exciting idea that Texas A&M is going to explore. We want to put what we're kind of calling a season of sprints on the calendar. We intend to run these sprints and staff them. We'll say something along the lines of, for this month and this month, we're going to be running back-to-back sprints, but it's going to be an open invitation for people who have development resources and want to plug into the project. So we hope to have a very well curated backlog with a lot of very accessible issues. And Texas A&M has been developing on Folio for many years at this point, so we can assist in kind of onboarding developers into the development process. And we're going to explore this as a mechanism for hopefully bringing more development resources to bear on the workflow problem than Texas A&M could field all by themselves. And maybe next WOLFcon, you'll be hearing me talk about how this is a horrible idea, but maybe we'll be talking about how it worked great. So this, I'm going to leave y'all with that. So if you have development resources that you are interested in getting involved in workflows, show up on that workflow, #workflow Slack, and you will be hearing about future sprints that you will be able to get involved with. So yes. Oh, thank you. Thank y'all so much.